A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." Here ends the reading. His name is Mark McDonald, and he wore badge number 00001. The first employee at what was, back in 1973, a relatively unknown startup company founded by Bill Gates and Paul Allen, Microsoft. In the business world of startup companies, employees who are hired first typically reap the greatest profits, often in the form of stock options that skyrocket in value when the company goes public. This business model spelled very good news for Mark McDonald, as it has for others who got in early on startups that would go on to become successful companies. As an economics major back in the day, and now a super fan of the television show Shark Tank, in which entrepreneurs seek celebrity investors, I can appreciate a good business plan. But in this week's gospel, Jesus tells a parable to remind us that God's kingdom is very different than the business models of most startups. The Jesus way is a world of grace and not merit, status reversal instead of status worship, undeserved generosity rather than pay for services provided. Jesus would not fare well on Shark Tank. Our Old Testament lesson today, the story of the manna in the wilderness, provides a helpful lens for interpreting the parable of the vineyard laborers. Out in the wilderness with the people of Israel, God is creating a new people who will embody an alternative to the ways of Egypt, an alternative to the ways of dominion and submission, rich and poor, powerful and powerless. Central to the formation of that people is the gift of manna. Nothing fancy, just basic sustenance. It is daily bread. But perhaps most importantly, manna is a gift that cannot be stockpiled or stored away. We learn in Exodus chapter 16, verse 20, that when people try to gather more than their share, the extra manna becomes worm-ridden and foul. You see, with manna, everyone has plenty, but no one has too much. The leaders and the servants receive the same amount. The people who work all day and the people who have little to do receive the same amount. The able and the disabled receive the same amount. Plenty, but not too much. And the manna is a gift. The story becomes an embodiment of the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. It is echoed when Jesus is out in the wilderness, when he feeds thousands with a few loaves and a couple of fish. Everyone has plenty, and no one has too much. Jesus also seeks to create a new people, a new order of God. He shares this parable with the disciples as they struggle to understand the reign of God within the old frameworks of the world that divided rich and poor, superior and inferior, deserving and undeserving. Through the parable, Jesus seeks to create the possibility of something new. If taken literally, the parable of the vineyard laborers would disturb any business person. For any of us, really, it goes against what seems just and fair, which is not unusual when it comes to Jesus' parables. Take, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. The older brother is angry that his younger brother, who squandered his inheritance, is not only welcomed home by their father, but given a party. The older son, the one who stayed home and did what he was supposed to do, apparently never had a party thrown in his honor. It is not fair. Just like the landowner who treats each of the laborers equally, the ones who worked all day in the blazing sun, and the ones who came on near the end of the shift, they each get the same pay. It is not fair. What we learn from the parable, and this is easy to overlook, is that the landowner begins by giving everyone in the story work. Each of the laborers is unemployed, and each is given work to do with the promise of pay. They all begin in the same situation, but easily forget by the end of the day where they started. Their energy goes not to the fact that they have work and are being paid, but to the inequity that they see. Envy becomes more important than what they have received. How often do we find ourselves envious of another's gifts, talents, possessions, or social status? It is helpful to remind ourselves that whether it is ours or someone else's, God is the giver of every good gift. Are you envious because I am generous? Asked the landowner in Matthew chapter 20, verse 15. Or more literally in Greek, is your eye evil because I am good? Earlier in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 6, verses 22 and 23, Jesus warns of the dangers of having an evil eye. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? One interesting aspect of our experience during the coronavirus pandemic is that with everyone wearing masks, we are forced to look more closely into someone's eyes. And I think that for many of us, during normal times, it is something we don't always and may not prefer to do. We look down, we look away. It can be disconcerting, uncomfortable. Looking into someone's eyes is a different experience. But why is that? Because unlike other expressions and gestures, it's difficult to pretend with our eyes. There's something true and hidden and deep in our eyes. And perhaps it's not a stretch to say the eyes are a window into the soul. So what about the eyes of God? What would you see if you could look into the eyes of God? What would you see if you could look into God's very soul? And would we like what we see? Today's parable provides us with a glimpse into the eyes of God and suggests that we may not like what we see. Sheer, unexplainable, unbelievable generosity. Uncomfortable, suspicious generosity. And while we may claim we want to believe in generosity, it is oh so difficult. Even receiving true generosity for ourselves is something we tend to resist. Me? Really? Are you sure? What did I do? So we measure it and account for it and calculate it. And generosity is not measurable or accountable or able to be calculated, which is the point of the parable. God's generosity is on display. God's unmeasurable, unexplainable, unbelievable grace is on display. Jesus leaves us with this question: can we learn to see through the eyes of God? Because our ideas of what is right and wrong, of what is just and unjust, are not necessarily God's ideas. And in fact, our God is a lousy bookkeeper. If we look with envy, if we look through the worldly lens of fairness and getting what one deserves, we will be left disappointed. But if we can learn to see another way, we will experience the joy and gratefulness of God's astounding generosity extended to us all. Amen.